What's up, guys? Hopefully, you all had a good day. Last night I was actually watching the new documentary that's come out on Netflix, about the Grenfell Tower fire, which obviously, this year, marks 8 years since that horrendous event. Um, and recently, a brand new documentary was released on Netflix about the Grenfell Tower fire. I definitely recommend you guys, if you haven't already seen it, to go and watch it because it's a really, really good documentary. It's very, very interesting. It is very interesting. I think it's a hard one to watch. It is a tough one. It is a tough one to watch, but it's a very interesting one. We'll say. I mean, for me personally, I always find it hard to, watch documentaries and things like that about the Grenfell Tower fire, and to think about all of those people that lost their lives that night, over 70 odd people died, and a lot, some of which were kids, and that's why that's what, it always hits me more than anything is knowing that kids died in that fire. I just can't imagine. I mean, yeah, as an adult, as an adult in that situation, you are going to be absolutely terrified and going to be very confused, very scared. But you imagine just how much more confused and scared those kids must have felt in that situation. They would have been way more scared, way more terrified than the adults were in that situation, and it's a terrible thing to think about. You know, the one thing, as I said the other week, because I did a video talking about the Grenfell Tower fire, obviously honouring, the 8th anniversary, the 8 year anniversary, and all of that. And I said in that video, my first initial reaction was, how on earth had a fire spread up a building that quickly? I mean, you never really see that, you never really see a fire spread up a building as quickly as we saw in that incident. The fact that that fire would, spread up that building so quickly was just unbelievable. Um, I think you also have to question the advice that was given to people that night. I don't think they should have been advising people to stay put in their flats. I think that without a doubt, was the wrong advice to be giving people in that situation. You shouldn't be. It's like, why would you advise people to stay put in their flats? Like, to me, that seems like the wrong advice to be giving people. Like, you would want to, you would tell people to try and make, whatever attempt they had to get out of there. Um, it's just a it's just a horrible situation, really, to think about what those people went through. But as I said, that documentary was really, really, it was really good. But there are parts of that documentary that got me a little bit, got me a little bit teary eyed. I remember that I was, the young girl on there. She was, I think, it was it was her and her parents. It was the Gomez family, Marcio and his wife and their daughter Luana. It was talking on there, um, and she was talking about, obviously, when they were walking down the stairs and they were stepping over all of these bodies and everything that were on the stairs like that. You know, that hit that was, I was like, oh my god. I can't imagine. I can't begin to imagine how terrible and how awful, just how awful that must have been for, for her walking, stepping over all these dead bodies and everything, and like these bodies and everything on the stairs. Um, I also feel for Marcio and his family, his wife, knowing that, they lost their little boy in that, unfortunate incident. Obviously, well, he was stillborn. He died from the effects of the smoke. Um, and obviously he was born at I think his wife was 7 months pregnant at the time. Yeah, she was 7 months pregnant at the time, and you know, um, I mean, obviously you think about it, like all those people earlier on in the day would have been going around, going about, blissfully about, their day, going about their big, their business, doing all, doing whatever they were doing, completely unaware of the terror that was about to unfold in the early hours of the morning. They would have had no reason to believe, those people that died that in that fire would have had no reason to believe they were going to die in it, they were going to die that night. They had no reason to believe, anything was going to happen. No one could have known. No one was to know what was going to happen. Those kids obviously that died, obviously they went to school that day. They would have gone to school for, you know, what was probably, they were, unaware, but completely unaware of the fact that that was the last time they were going to be going to school. Like they weren't going to be going to school the next day because they were going to be killed. It's just so horrible to think about. Like, my heart goes out to all of, the people, the families of those who died in the Grenfell Tower fire, and the survivors. I mean, it must be so hard for the people that survived that fire. Knowing that they got out of that fire, but so many of the people they lived with, and so many people they probably saw every day and spoke to, probably every day, didn't get out of that fire alive. They've been able to carry on. They've been able to, they've been allowed to live their lives, and make, and obviously, carry on, as normal. But you know, so many, people they know, so many people that they would have spoken to every day, and Steve probably would have seen every day, have had their lives, had their lives really taken away from them. You know, and imagine what that feels like knowing they survived, but so many people that they knew and lived with in that tower but didn't get out alive. Um, I mean, it's things like that have always given me that fear of living like in an upper floor of like right towards the top of a tower block. Because you think about it, like you're living that so high up. How would you get out if there was a fire? Like you wouldn't get out of that. This was the thing. Like there were so many people that lived up in like the top floors at Ramville. They were never gonna get out. There was no way they could have gone all the way down the stairs. With the stairs being covered in thick black smoke. You know, um, I know some of them did, but you know, um, I mean, it's just horrible, like horrible to think about. Um, I mean, at least those people that lived on the lower floors had a better chance of getting out of the building. Shame, unfortunately, same can be said for those that lived quite high up. It was impossible. Um, it's always really haunting when you go back and you watch the videos and you see the people, you see the videos, kids screaming, and there was people, the people saying, "Oh my God, they're screaming, they're screaming," like. I mean, it's I think about, so many young, like, so many kids who had their whole lives, practically had so much of their lives ahead of them, had so many more years, to live. They had so much more of their lives to live, and they had that, that they unfortunately had that taken away from them. Some of those kids probably would have had, probably had very promising, futures ahead of them. Probably very bright, positive futures ahead of them. And you know, they've had all those dreams and, you know, all those possibilities and all, you know, all of those, you know, and all the, and then everything just taken away from them, you know. Um, I don't think anything will ever, you know, no amount of justice will ever make up for what people lost that night. You know, people lost their loved ones and they can't get them back. You know, um, you know, people. I don't think any amount of justice will, you know, it will be enough. You know, to be honest. But yeah, that, as I said, that documentary, it's a really good one, but it's definitely a tough one to watch. As I said, I always find, you know, it hard to watch anything, you know, that relates to Grenfell Tower, you know. Um, and it's always so, like, heartbreaking and so devastating to think about what those people went through that night and how scared and terrified they must have been. And when you watch these kind of documentaries and things like that about the Grenfell Tower, it really does sort of kind of make you think a lot about that. It kind of really makes you think about, you know, it really makes you sort of think about how scared, like, it really makes you sort of think about how scared and, you know, terrified and confused all of those people must have been that night, you know, and then how traumatizing, you know, that must have been for the people that survived. I mean, yeah, you know, I'm sure that they're relieved and that, you know, that they survived that, but they've also got to, you know, they've also got to kind of come to terms with the fact that although they got out alive, so many people that they lived with, so many people they knew, so many people they would have seen, everybody would have seen every day and spoken to every day, didn't get out of that building alive, you know. And I think that the advice that people were given that night to stay put was the bigger, you know, a huge mistake. You know, I honestly don't understand why that advice was given to people. You know, that's one of those things about the Grenfell Tower fire that has really always really baffled me. Is the fact that people were told to stay put in their flats. Like, I just don't know. I don't get why people were given that advice. Um, you know, I don't know if there was, you know, if there was maybe a reason why people were given that advice, but you know, it's like when you watch, you know, these things about Grenfell Tower and all that, it does make you want to cry. It really genuinely does. Um, like, I mean, as I said, I think the thing that, you know, that upsets me more than anything, you know, when I watch these things about Grenfell Towers, it just makes me think about those kids. You know, it makes me think about those kids that were in that fire, and you know, it makes me think about just how scared and terrified they must have been. You know, I can't imagine what it, you know, being a child and being caught up in that. You know, especially for those children who didn't survive, it must have been heartbreaking. You know, knowing that they, you know, it's like, what were they thinking in their final moments? What was going through it? You know, it makes you wonder what was going, like, you know, what must have been going through people's minds. You know, what they must, you know, what must they, what must, you know, they have been thinking. You know, I mean, none of them, you know, you know, all of those people, they would have gone to bed that night completely unaware that they were going to be woken up in the early hours of the morning, being told to get out of their flats because the building was on fire. You know, I hate to say it, but I feel with the Grenfell Tower, I feel like it was always something more to do with a fridge freezer that started to fire. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, you know. But it's just crazy when you watch these kind of documentaries and you know you look at how quick that fire spread up the building and everything. You know, it makes you very rarely see that. Um, Now, the one story that's always interested me is I know that there was a story of a woman throwing her baby out from the grenfell tower or someone bought the baby. I don't know if there was any truth to that, but that was one of the stories I saw at Grenfell. Um, was that a woman had thrown her baby out of the building and someone bought the baby. She was asking people to save the baby, to save her baby and everything. Um, and someone bought the baby, but I don't know if there was any truth to that. That's one thing I'm not 100% sure on. Um, I think it really. I think it's the the Ramfell Tower documentary via documentary on Netflix. It's definitely one that's worth watching. It's probably one of the best documentaries I've watched about the fire. It's probably definitely one of the most interesting ones that I've watched. Um, I mean that's one of the good things about documentaries like that. If you do is I do find them very interesting. Um, I think it was a very well done documentary. I think whoever made that documentary did a really good job with it. I think they should be very impressed with it. To be honest, it was a really, really good and really interesting documentary. Probably one of the best documentaries I probably watched this year. But it was a very emotional and very tough documentary to watch. It was very hard and painful documentary to watch. Knowing thinking on what people went through that night and the devastation and terror and the horror that that they experienced that night. 8 years ago. Um, I mean, and I hope that all of those people that survived. I hope that they're not they're not still struggling with the aftermath of that. You know, but you never know. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Just wanted to get my thoughts on that documentary. I'll see you for another video tomorrow. Bye bye.